Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Hey there, Stuart here. Welcome to the Talent Equation. Before we jump into this week's podcast, I wanted to let you know about an event coming up that I'm really excited about. At the beginning of 2020, I will be joining up with Juan Gonzalez Mendia from Sudamerica Coaching, who is hosting another one of his Future of Coaching conferences. This year, I'll be joined by Mark Bennett, again, Amy Price, who's been on the podcast. Check out her episode around the use of video games in coaching. Also, James Leith, who is a fantastic coach from America, who works with John O'Sullivan on the Changing the Game project, has a wealth of experience to share with us. And also a dinner speech by Brian Ashton, the legendary England rugby coach that I'm also really, really excited about. Can't wait to catch up with him and hear the nuggets that he's going to share with everybody. The good news for everybody who's a listener is that Juan is providing a 20% discount if you wanted to join us and essentially have a Christmas present to yourself, a Christmas present of learning. So when you go over, search up Future of Coaching Conference, you'll find it. And when you go into the booking, you'll see there's an option to take advantage of that discount. So jump on into that. There's actually an extra discount if you're a part of my conclave group. So a number of people are signed up and are joined up to get together with me on a monthly basis to share experiences and learn. If you've been thinking about doing that, then now's the time, because not only do you get all the wealth of experience by being part of that group, you also get an extra 10% discount on joining us at the Future of Coaching as well. So if you've been umming and ahhing, there you go. Now's the time, take the plunge, and it would be great not only to have you on the conclave, but also to have you at the Future of Coaching, and it would be great to meet you in person. So there you go, that's the main thing I wanted to let everybody know. Without further ado, let's jump into this week's podcast.
This week's episode is going to be an interesting one for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is I'm really, really excited and delighted to introduce Annie Vernon to the show. Annie, welcome to Talent Equation.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here.
You've been doing a lot of stuff, and it's a good story. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just starting with that, and then I'll kind of play back to people why I'm so excited. I always say I'm excited about every episode. I am, really, because the podcast is only as good as its guests. Nobody tunes in to listen to me rant on. So basically, just start from the beginning and tell me about the journey.
So my background is that I was lucky enough to compete for my country on the British rowing team for 8 years. So in that time, I went to 6 World Championships and 2 Olympic Games, and I retired after the 2012 London Games, having also been to the 2008 Beijing Games. And after I finished, I mean, like a lot of athletes, I've had a variety of different jobs, bits and bobs, but I think something that always really fascinated me, both when I was competing and afterwards, was the mental side of sport, was the psychology of it. And I had the opportunity through meeting people at Bloomsbury to take that interest one step further and really scratch the surface of the mental side of sport. And the result, 2.5 years later, was Mind Games, which is my book on the psychology of elite athletes, which came out earlier this year.
And you actually came into my place of work not long ago, and organised by a colleague of mine, Adam Freeman-Pask, who I believe you were essentially rowing colleagues for a period of time. He was certainly, I know, in that part of the world. And you actually managed to come in. I sadly wasn't in the place because I was really annoyed about, because I really wanted to listen in. So in many ways, I'm, if you like, cheating, because having missed that event, I get to talk to you one-to-one on this podcast. So talk me through a little bit around, before we get into the books, I'm genuinely interested in talking about that. I mean, I imagine with a lot of people who come on the podcast, often when they're telling me their story, there is usually something in the backstory that acts as a bit of a catalyst for what they're doing now. So I'm wondering if you've got something similar, i.e. either through your days competing as an elite athlete, or actually, I'm also very interested in your developmental journey and your developmental experiences, and if there's anything there that has sort of feels like it's particularly relevant to what's the sort of main motivation for the book.
Well, I think that really was one of the great things about the book, is at every step of all the things I was investigating, I had the opportunity of reflecting back on my own experiences, and I guess the questions I was asking of other people, I could then ask of myself and say, okay, fine, so if you built your confidence like this, what happened when it was put to the test? And then I could ask myself the same question, and it was a real kind of interesting journey of self-analysis apart from anything. Where did the interest in psychology come from? Well, I think it's one of those things. Rowing is a team sport. I mean, people say it's the ultimate team sport. I'm sure other team sports will dispute that, but it certainly is a sport where there is no room for individual stars. There's almost no room for individuality. You are a cog in a machine. And in order to be a really good team player, you have to understand your teammates. You have to know them inside out. And I suppose it was honing those skills of trying to look inside my teammates' head. What interests you? What motivates you? What excites you? What are you scared of? And in the same way, opening myself to that same kind of analysis as we were building our teams and building our crews every year. I suppose it was that which really made me understand that, do you know what? There's 100 different ways to reach the top of elite sport. There's 100 different ways to set yourself up mentally. And those are the questions that I aimed to answer in the book. The book's based on partly my own experiences, but mainly looking through the lens of, I interviewed between 60 and 70 elite athletes, coaches and psychologists from across a whole variety of sports backgrounds, levels of success, all the rest of it. And to have those, just that quantity of narratives and that quantity of insights, it was just so fascinating. And I suppose it really was, that started with rowing. That started when I was on the rowing team and looked around the people around me and thought, wow, we're all so different, but we're all achieving the same level. How could this be?
And something that struck me was, do you think that so I used to work in golf quite a lot. And obviously the sort of concept of sports psychology, very prevalent within that world. With, I might add, some more positive or less positive, I think, experiences for the athletes on the receiving end. However, one thing that occurred to me that I wanted to ask you about was, do you think that sports where an athlete has, so for example, what I mean is where the dynamics are slightly different in the sense that in rowing, although yes, absolutely, you are part of a team, you're pulling together, etc., there's an awful lot of you in there, isn't there? There's actually an awful lot of you, and there's an awful lot of space for the brain to start to play all its clever tricks on you, isn't there? And I'm wondering whether those kinds of sports with those kinds of dynamics really lend themselves, firstly, to this kind of exploration, and whether you think there is something, because I've also experienced, having worked in a team sport and coached in team sports, that the kind of psychological space really isn't explored in anything like the same depth. So I'm just wondering if you think that's to do with the nature of the activities themselves, or you think there are some other dynamics at play?
Well, that was something that I was able to look at in the book, is how mental skills not only differ sport to sport, but they really are completely bespoke. So take a marathon runner and a weightlifter. They look completely different. Okay, they have very different physical skills, but mentally they have completely different mental skills. You know, a weightlifter is all about that one explosive movement. It really is, I guess, you know, a test of your nerve. The marathon runner, in some ways, it's about boredom. It's about dealing with the monotony. It's about being focused for hour after hour after hour. So if you put a weightlifter in a marathon, they probably completely mess up, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Which is why penalty shootouts in football are so interesting, because footballers are so bad at them. But would you expect a footballer, you know, used to a dynamic, free-flowing game, 11v11, decision-making, trying to find space, thinking on your feet, would you expect them to be good at a sport where it's all about a one-off moment, all the pressure, everyone's watching? No, you want a golfer. In that moment, you want a golfer to step up and take that kick. So it's so bespoke and so unique. And I suppose it allowed me, again, to think about, well, what are the mental skills you need to be good at in rowing? And I decided that staring at the back of someone's head was a good place to start. If you don't like staring at the back of someone's head, don't go into rowing.
What was it that got you involved in the sport in the first place?
Oh, like most people, accident.
Right.
You know, I guess that's probably the same answer for the vast majority of athletes out there. I mean, there happened to be a rowing club not far from where I grew up, down here in Cornwall. I took it up when I was probably about 17, 18. And straight away I loved it. I loved how hard it was. I loved the fact there were no shortcuts. I loved the fact that you really did get out of it what you put in. And also I really liked that in rowing, it is a team sport, but it's also an individual sport. You know, you touched on that earlier. You train on your own and you compete as a team a lot of the time. So it really does test you in lots of different ways. And also, the place I learnt to row in Cornwall is just this beautiful estuary, kind of wooded inland creek. And then I went to the rowing team, which is on a gravel pit near Reading, next to the train line. I thought, nothing beautiful about this.
Take away all the joy.
Yeah, it is. It was also a good way to meet tall men. I'm not ashamed to say.
I love the fact that there's quite a lot of different motivations involved. On that subject though, of the team dynamics, some people might have been surprised at that, to hear that. And obviously, you know, it obviously depends on the event, and the team dynamics, you know, depend on the size of the crew and all those sorts of things. But how did they materialise? Because that's kind of an interesting space and something I'm not sure that people would probably think of automatically.
Yeah, I mean, team dynamics is fascinating in a sports team. And again, I think in rowing, because it is such an intense relationship. And also in rowing, you have a 1-person boat, 2-person boat, 4 and an 8-person boat. And actually those relationships you have, if there's just 2 of you, completely different relationship you have if there's 8 of you with a cox, with a person steering.
Yeah.
And it's almost that your level of responsibility drops and your level of trust has to come up to match it. So that the sum total of faith that you have in your finished product is the same, but in a big boat, you have much less control over it. I mean, gosh, you could write a PhD thesis on team dynamics in a rowing boat. Particularly, you know, you could write a thesis on women's rowing boats and men's rowing boats. Ultimately, every single boat I've been in has been a different mix of personalities. We had a different way of operating. We had a different vibe, and each time we made it work. But every single one was unique.
That's interesting in that sense, though, that you know, boats are put to. I mean, is any thought given to, for example, like how boats and crews are put together from the perspective of like personality dynamics? I.e., do you want, you know, what's the best way to do it? Do you want a mix of personalities because then, you know, you kind of get the best out of each other, or do you want some similarities, or what? Do they think about that, or is it literally just more based on the physical side?
It's 100% based on the physical side.
Okay.
I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe you could construct an argument for, oh, well, this person gets the most out of the rest of the crew, so they should be in. But ultimately, that's not what the athletes want. The athletes want, if I'm good enough, put me in the boat. And then whatever blend of personalities you end up with, you make that work. Right. Sometimes better than others, but like I said, you find a way of making it work. And
so this probably, you know, circles us back towards the psychological space. How much of a performance rate limiter is the human dynamic element and the personality dynamic element, and then the associated psychological components, how much could that be a rate limiter?
Huge, absolutely huge. And it is something that you have to get good at, in the same way, in exactly the same way that, I don't know, as a young athlete, you realise that you need to get more power, you need to improve your endurance, you need to improve your technique. In exactly the same way, you learn very early on, geez, I need to figure out what kind of team player I'm going to be. And there's no surprise that the people at the top of the squad are the people who are the best team players. The guys easiest to row with are the ones who get to the top, because it is self-selecting. If you're always going to get more out of your teammates than other people, then chances are you'll do better in all the selection, and then you'll end up in the top boats. So, it's not something, gosh, I was on the rowing team. I retired 7 years ago, so things might have changed since then. But there wasn't a huge amount of work done on that area, on blending crews, and I think they probably could have done more.
I'm just thinking, in my quest for, the next edge, maybe we're onto something here, or you are, I'm not, around, kind of almost like, given that physiologically, you've probably got a cohort of elite rowers who are, I know there's still going to be relatively big differences, but broadly speaking, in the grand scheme of things, you've now got some physiological specimens who are all able to generate the kind of power they need to be able to propel the boat. Then maybe starting to find the right, because it feels a little bit like that's where maybe the team sports might be able to support, because you often get, in a team dynamic, you get players who aren't actually technically, physically, or even sometimes tactically as well equipped as others, but their value to the team is absolutely key because of, for example, their ability to be selfless, or their ability to get the best out of others, or their tactical acumen and the way they can coordinate and organise. So I'm wondering whether that might be a new potential space for rowing to go in.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that's where rowing is unique amongst team sports, in that there is that because it's an endurance sport, there is that way of ranking people. So everyone can, so the coach can't argue with the numbers. You can't say, well, actually, I think you're better than, X is better than Y, if Y's just beaten X in a race. Whereas in a sport like hockey, because it's so much more subjective, the coach can make those kind of calls.
Sure.
That, or just preferred playing styles, preferred tactical decisions. You're right. I'm sure that rowing and all team sports could make huge leaps forward in that, and it could be they are. But when I was on the rowing team, it was run in a pretty old-fashioned way, and most of those personnel have now moved on, thankfully. But I don't think they would have been very interested in the fluffy stuff.
Well, and who knows? In the 7 years since you stopped, and maybe this is the leaps and bounds that they've made.
No, they have a new performance director, and I hear he's doing a fantastic job. So I'm sure that's one of the areas he's considering.
What made me think about it was I'm reading a really interesting book at the moment. It's a little bit like of a follow-up to Moneyball. It's called Astroball,
Right.
and what it does is it talks about how the Houston Astros, who were perennial no-hopers, went about, if you like, rebuilding their franchise. And one of the ways in which they've done that is to use the best that analytics and data had, but to combine it with the human side.
Right.
So I'm wondering in your space where, obviously heavily driven by the numbers, like you say, if you can put the wattage out and get the times, you're in, sort of thing. But I'm wondering whether then maybe there's something to be gained from that around actually bringing that human and people side in.
I'm sure there is. Yeah, I'm sure there is. I guess the question is how you quantify that. So because I'm sure that rowers aren't dissimilar to other athletes. We want everything to have a number, everything to have a ranking, because you want to know how you can get better. Don't just tell me I was quite good today. Tell me out of 10 how good I am and how I can get the other 2 points. So yeah, I'm sure that people would love it, but it has to be something, I guess, that people can really, really commit to.
And you've just touched on something that I think sport, what they call the CGS sport, centimetres, grams, seconds sports. I think that's what you're talking about actually must be pretty baked into the culture, that the need to have everything measured, numbers, because that's your way of seeing progress, I guess. It
is. And I touch on this in the book when I talk about competitiveness. I think one of the reasons that elite athletes are perceived as being super competitive is that you're in an environment where everything is ranked. Everything is measured. I mean, an average day, I counted it up. I think it was in the region of 15 different data points about just me, just little old me on an average training day. So if you're in a situation where everything about you is entered on a spreadsheet and you're encouraged to think, right, how can I get that better? How can I be better hydrated? How can I have a better body fat percentage? How can I lift bigger weights and sleep for more hours and be better on my recovery and eat more healthy food? If everything's quantified, then it trains that part of you. So actually you become incredibly competitive about the smallest things. I mean, I remember that I don't know, someone would come into a changing room in the morning and say, oh, I got drugs tested last night. Someone would say, well, how long did you have to wait before you could produce a sample? And they say, oh, actually, it was really quick. It was only 10 minutes. Someone else would say, well, I did it last week in 5 minutes. Someone else would say, well, I did it in 2 minutes. I heard about someone who did it in a minute. So just the stupidest little things. You've got some people who would always want to, in inverted commas, win at it, even if it meant absolutely nothing. So I guess in elite sport, you start off with somebody who's a little bit competitive. Probably everyone remembers kids at primary school who were always trying to race. And then you put them in an environment where that's nurtured and trained, and suddenly they're a 20-something-year-old who's just ridiculously competitive about every tiny detail.
You've reminded me, actually, there was a great show, wasn't there, with James Cracknell and Ben Fogle trying to get to either the North Pole or the South Pole. I think it was the North. And I remember seeing that this huge competitive drive in James, particularly, but to the point where he actually ruined the team because he kind of made himself break. He broke himself in the drive to be where he wanted to get to. And it was Ben that almost had to do then the picking up bit. And in many ways was almost the stronger of the two in a strange kind of way. Are they experiences you had around this competitive space where almost you have to almost protect each other from yourselves?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's one of the key things that came out of the research for the book is that, like everything, competitiveness in overdrive is dangerous in the same way that, confidence in overdrive is arrogance. Too much motivation becomes self-destroying because you can never stop. And certainly, competitiveness, it has to be channeled in the right way. You really can't. And this is something that Catherine Granger, the 5-time Olympic medalist rower, said to me when I interviewed her for the book, is that she said, one of the things I've learned over my long career is that, you can't win every fight. Don't even try. Pick and choose your battles. And this is something I remember when I was first on the rowing team as a young athlete. I'd look at Catherine and I think, she's not trying half the time. She's not even bothering getting out of bed. This is pathetic. I thought she was meant to be a really hotshot rower. God, I've just beaten her in a, Wednesday morning paddle. And then, the day that it actually mattered, the stopwatch came out, she'd be gone. She'd leave me for dust. And I think, oh, this is so annoying. I beat her on a Tuesday morning and then she thrashes me in the trials. How's that fair? And it wasn't for a while until I realised, oh, right, hang on. Maybe what she's actually doing is picking and choosing her battles so that she's ready to be competitive and to fight on the big days, but on the little days, she's not. She's giving herself a break. And she said to me when I sat down for the book and grilled her about it, she said, yeah, I learned how to do that. I worked out how to look after myself. And that was something, again, that came through from the coaches that I interviewed. They said, yeah, a lot of the time we're protecting our athletes from themselves because they would try and destroy themselves, and we're there to hold them back a lot of the time.
And lots discussed at the moment in the world of coaching around the idea of duty of care.
Yeah.
It's a pretty complex world that we live in now as coaches, and it's not. I think it's a more complex world than it was when I started. I have to say, and that idea of duty of care. This is something that I don't think is talked about an awful lot. Which is, I think most people think of, for example, the concept of athlete motivation as, how do you get people to be, driven to train or driven to practice or to play at their best in games and give the tub thumping, rabble rousing, any given Sunday style coaching speech. But actually it's something very different, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that was interesting when I spoke to a man called Ken Way, who was the psychologist for the Leicester City team when it won the Premier League in 2016. And he said that's one of the most common questions he's asked is, were you there to motivate athletes? Are you there to inspire them? And he's saying, no, almost completely the reverse. These guys have got motivation dripping out of every single pore of their skin. I'm not there to try and turn that up. I'm always there to turn that down and try and look after them. And I certainly agree just on the duty of care bit. And I think that's one thing that came out of the research of the book, which actually really, really bothered me. Just the number of stories from athletes of terrible coaching experiences, bordering on emotional abuse. And I suppose, when I've been to rowing clubs and sports clubs to talk about the book, and people have said, oh, what's your closing message? I've always said, coaches, think about the influence you have on your athletes. And I think a lot of coaches, perhaps people who have been around doing it for donkey's years, and it's just, it's another person on the conveyor belt. I don't think they always understand the influence they have over young people. And of course, the good ones do, and this absolutely isn't a general comment, but there's a lot of bad ones out there. And I guess I hope that, coaches will read the book and realise that for a 16-year-old kid, you are the most important person in their life after their mum and dad. And think about every single comment that you make, offhand comment, could be something that they carry around with them for life. Particularly if you tell a young girl she's looking a bit fat, well, that could be an eating disorder for the next 10 years. Just be wary of the responsibility that you have.
I'm interested. I'm very interested in that. One of the reasons I do this podcast, if you like, is because I think I'm acutely aware that there are a lot of people out there who, unwittingly, I think in the main, I refuse to believe that people are out there. There's like hundreds of thousands of people out there with malice, desperately trying to ruin the lives of athletes. Yeah. Most of the time, it's just like a lack of awareness or a lack of education, etc., etc. So, in terms of some of the examples of that, I guess just pulling that out a little bit more. I mean, I was interested to hear that you've heard this story a lot, and I've also that there are a lot of bad experiences out there. I think that's something sometimes I struggle to convince people of. I think they want to believe that the experiences are better than they are. So I'm interested in I'd like to just dwell on that for a moment, if you wouldn't mind. Yeah,
I mean, I think it's tricky because the sort of people who become athletes, are a particular type of person. I mean, I clearly absolutely loved my time in elite sport. I've got two brothers. I think both of them would have hated it. I think both our personalities are just too different. The same way there's a sort of type of person who becomes a coach. I mean, clearly they're absolutely passionate about their sport, whatever that sport is. But also there is a power aspect there. There is, and power is seen as a negative thing. And I don't mean this negatively. It's, you want to encourage other people. You want to help other people. You want to be a teacher. You want to inspire other people with the same love you have for athletics or canoeing or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But sometimes, to repeat myself, I wonder if people realise that actually that power can be a negative thing. And one way that Marilyn Okoro, who's a GB 4x 400 metre and 800 metre runner, Olympic bronze medalist, the way that she summed it up to me, and she had some dreadful coaching experiences. She said, I think a lot of coaches see themselves as wizards who have put clay people together. I've created you, I can destroy you. And I think I really like that image. And I think that chimes with a lot of, not my own experiences. I was lucky to have 3 fantastic coaches, but a lot of the other stories I heard, it's just this idea that coaches think they are in control of their athletes. They are completely responsible for their successes. And to me, that's not coaching. That's dominating. And that's when it's about you. It's not about your athlete. And certainly coaching is changing. When I spoke to younger coaches coming through, like Mel Marshalls, who coaches Adam Peaty, the swimmer. Yeah. I mean, she was just wonderful. And she said, I'm a young girl, young woman. I'm pretty different to the older crew I see around me. And she said it is changing. And she said, I'm very much, it's all about the athlete. It's not about me at all. And she said, the second it's about you and not the athlete, that's when you've got to stop.
And I think what's brilliant about hearing the story about Mel is I think she's been, like you say, one of the beneficiaries of, as you say, a young coach, but also benefited, I think, from some of the support that's now available to coaches that weren't available to many coaches back in the day. It makes me laugh sometimes. Like young coaches I'm mentoring quite often will say to me, have you got anything that you can send me, some stuff I can read and all that sort of stuff? And I kind of just sort of smile at them, look sideways and go, no. I go, there is that brilliant thing, it's called the internet. Because like when I started out, you had to go to the library to get a book. I mean, who did that, and there's just very little information out there. Whereas now, actually, the amount of coaching podcasts, the amount of mentoring, etc. I know Mel, for example, was part of UK Sports, what was called the Elite Coach Apprenticeship Programme. Was able to rub shoulders with the likes of Danny Kerry, who was also on the programme. And they were all able to sort of peer support each other, as well as have mentors, as well as learn some new things. Yeah. And I'm not going to say that is what created Mel Marshall any more than Mel Marshall is what created Adam Peaty. But the point being is gaining support as a coach, I think, does have a correlation with a better athlete experience, which you then hope has a correlation with athlete performance. Sure. I think in the past, a lot of the coaching culture was athlete performance was the priority. And if the athlete and the athlete experience, well, if that had to sort of go by the wayside in the drive for athlete performance, well, so be it. And I think times have definitely changed as far as that's concerned.
Definitely. And I think it mirrors just how society has changed. I mean, I go into a lot of schools I work for the Youth Sport Trust, and actually the way that the students talk to the teachers and the way that the atmosphere and the behaviour is completely different to when I was at school. Everything, it's more relaxed, it's more informal, it is much more student focused than I remember, in the late 90s when I was at school. So I would say that, elite sport is mirroring life and rightly so. I think the best. Well, there was a few fantastic people I spoke to for the coaching section, including Tony Minicello, who was just garrulous and and wonderful. And a point that he made, we were talking about the difference between the carrot and the stick. He said, when you're coaching, which one do you use most? And he said, when I started out, I was all about the stick. And now I'm a carrot farmer. He said, you know what, the stick doesn't work. He said, you can try it. In the short term, it'll get you results. It will never work in the long term. And he also said, I mean, people have disputed the theory, but people talk about the 10,000 hours rule for athletes. And he said, for a coach, it's 30,000 hours. You can't put a price on experience. You really can't. But I think the best kind of comment that I heard, which really to me sums up what coaching should be, was from Adrian Cassidy, who was my coach on the rowing team. And I said, what's a coach there for? And he said, a coach is there to be a mirror to their athletes. That's all. He said, you can't push them, you can't pull them, you can't change them. You're just showing them what they want to do and helping them all find a way to achieve it. Yeah. Which I like.
I have to say, I like the mirror analogy. Because sometimes also being a mirror is saying to them, is asking them the question, you said that you wanted to achieve this. Is the way you're currently behaving or the things you're doing aligned to what it was your goal? And quite often, I think people look into that mirror and don't like what they see. And that's quite a challenging scenario, but that's quite an important thing to do, isn't it? To keeping people essentially honest to the goals they've set for themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. And encouraging people to think for themselves.
Fascinating. I was interested in lots of the things that you talk about in this space, but did any of the coaches that you speak to, and I am obviously going to dwell a little bit on the coaching given that a lot of this podcast is focused on coaching, but did any of the coaches speak to you about because like your point there you just made about Tony, 30,000 hours, I 100% agree that the value of experience, because I do think that's critical. However, in the same way that this will sound like a strange analogy, but go with me. In the same way that like modern poker players become expert really quickly. Why? Because they can play thousands of hands on the internet really fast.
Right.
Whereas back in the day, you'd have to spend thousands of hours in smoky poker rooms, playing the same number of hands, and it would take, years and years and years to gain the same level of expertise or experience. it obviously isn't everything. But nowadays, because A, there's information around there, and B, coaches, I think, now have a much better opportunity to talk to each other and to engage with each other than they ever have before. And the community now seems far more open to that, whereas in the past it was a lot more closed and people were very secretive and no, you're not having my secret. So it feels like, anyway, it's changing. So I kind of firstly wonder whether any coaches, whether any coaches now, I think, probably can learn faster if they want to. But I wonder if any of them sort of played back to you how important the learning process was for them. And what I mean by that is, was there anything that they kind of said, this was key for me, this was an important learning moment, and this really transformed me as a coach? Does anyone talk about that to you in any way?
Oh, yeah, hugely. I guess because a lot of the coaches I spoke to were young, in inverted commas, because I guess the average sports coach in this country is probably a man in their 60s. I should also say, when I went to embark on, there's a whole chapter on coaching. Yeah. I went to embark on the coaching chapter. It's probably the one that, I was writing as an outsider because I've never been a coach. I've only been an athlete. So
sure.
It's really fascinating to jump on the other side of the fence and try to understand it from the inside. So Adrian Cassidy, going back to him, my old rowing coach, he talked about a guy who was a bit more senior than him. He coached on the Australian rowing team and the British rowing team. He'd won Olympic medal. His crews had won Olympic medals, I should say. And Adrian sort of said, I was a really young coach. I was going on all these courses. I was trying to understand, rowing from the inside and how to coach. And he said, I spent, a couple of hours in the launch with this guy called Tim McLaren. And he said, Tim barely said a word through the whole session. And he gets to the end, he says to Tim, are you going to coach these guys? And he said, well, I thought that was quite a good session. I didn't really need to improve anything. And Adrian said, and it took him a while to understand this. And he said, Tim said to him, look, I don't have an original thought. I'm not a deep thinker. He said, all I can see is I take the best of what other people do and other people say to me, and I pull it together and I try and make sense of it. He said, all I do is just provide clarity, because everyone has an opinion and everyone has a thought, and I just try and pull it all together and get some clarity. And Adrian said that for him was just this real key turning point, that actually you're not trying to come up with a formula to turn coal into gold. All you're trying to do is provide some clarity and get some sense in the madness, because ultimately the things that we do in sport, it really isn't rocket science. We're not trying to split the atom. We're trying to row a boat, or we're trying to kick a ball, or we're trying to jump into a sandpit. Yeah. It's not a complicated thing to do, is it, at all?
Yeah.
But we complicate it, because particularly when we're full-time elite professionals with hundreds of people with PhDs trotting around, actually it seems a lot more complicated than it is, but it's not at its heart. And I think that almost is the joy. That is the joy of modern coaching. It's gone from a situation where the coach has to do everything, from being, the masseur to being the administrator, to booking flights. Actually, now all the coach has to do is coach, just do the technical side. So actually, they can be that role. They can have that voice where they're the voice of reason and sanity in amongst all the spreadsheets and all the craziness going on. So one way that Bob Brett, who's a really successful tennis coach, he's coached Ivanisevic and hundreds of other top-level tennis players. He said that I'm the GP. There's all these experts sat behind me I can refer people to, but I'm the GP. I'm the guy who sees them day and night, at their best, at their worst, picks them up, puts them back on their feet again. There's other people who are more intelligent to do the techie stuff, but kind of I'm the first point of contact.
It's interesting, actually. Something you just said there about, they can just do the coaching, do the technical stuff. I think I totally know what you're saying. And that, in many ways, that's when coaching is absolutely at its best. So what's actually gone into what is described as just doing the technical stuff, there's actually just loads to that. Yeah. So when someone can do something and almost give it in the simplest message, with the least amount of flower and noise and energy, and also in the with all the language and lots of words and all those sorts of things, when it's just the simplest, clearest, and your point about clarity is a really key one. But it's it's almost like the swan. It's the swan. It's graceful on the surface to you, the athlete, but underneath there's a whole plethora. So, for example, you mentioned the stuff about the masseuse and the physio and the data coming in from the analysts and all that sort of stuff. Well, the coach still has to make sense of all that in order to then interpret it and be a filter. I believe the coach has to be a filter. I think when it's done badly, the multidisciplinary approach is when the inputs are going all directly into the athlete. And, you know, the athlete has to try to make sense of that. And all the ologies want their space and want their time and this, that, and the other. And I actually think the coach's role actually is to be the interpreter and to go, right, you're giving me that information, you're giving me that information, you're giving me that information. Okay, great. Simplify that down, boil it down, then work with the athlete around taking all that information in order to devise the right thing for them. To you, it should feel like they haven't really done a lot, if that makes sense. Because their job is to do all the other stuff. It's a little like football managers. You know, football managers spend hours and hours and hours spent watching game tape of opposition, picking up information from scouts, getting stuff from the assistant coaches, etc., etc.
Yeah.
When it comes to game day, they'll deliver this what is should be a relatively short tactical maybe talk or whatever. They might go to individuals, and it won't feel like they've done a great deal, even though there's thousands of hours of prep maybe that's gone into it.
For sure, yeah. And somebody who I mean, I've never met him at all, but somebody who I think seems to always do a really good job of that, just from the outside, is Eddie Jones.
Yeah.
When you hear him interviewed, or more importantly, when you hear any of his players, you know, if any of his players are ever asked by the media, "Oh, what did Eddie say to you about this? What does Eddie tell you about this?" And the messages he seems to give them are just so succinct, like you said. Yeah. You know, that's what the player will say. "Oh, he told me I need to lose weight. He told me I needed to get better at passing. He told me I needed to get fitter." Yeah. And the interviewer will say, "Is that it?" "Yeah, that's all he told me." And actually, as a player, you just want to know how you can get better. You don't want to be told, "Yeah, everything's fine. I'm just not picking you because of the, because you're just not quite good enough." Well, actually, tell me something I can work on. I'm desperate to improve. I'm desperate to be a world champion. Tell me how to do it. And it seems from the outside that that's something that Eddie Jones does really well. Is he says, "Do this," and the players can go away and latch onto it.
100%, and I think that's one of the marks of the greats, isn't it? In fact, there's a quote you use, which is the idea of taking the right tools out of the right box at the right time.
Yeah, that's sort of Stuart Lancaster, former, in fact, Eddie Jones's predecessor. Yeah. I mean, he said, I can't remember if that was something he'd come up with or somebody had said to him, but that was his kind of. I said, "What's good coaching?" And he said, "Yeah, it's that. It's taking the right tools out of the right toolbox at the right time." Yeah. Understanding what that player or that situation requires and delivering that.
And I love that because it's, again, in itself, it's a simple message. But so going back to the point of, I think the act of coaching should be, and it is simple. Actually coaching, or what goes into coaching, doesn't have to be complicated, shouldn't be complicated, but it is complex. Yeah. So making sense of complexity, I think, is one of the key skills in my view. Going back to that point of the point you made a little bit earlier on around the idea of not keeping clarity. I believe this is one of the key things you can do as a coach for an athlete or any group of athletes, is to get them to be clear on what it is they are, their ambition is, or what they want, and also to then make it clear what they might need to do in order to achieve that desire. Because for a lot of people, I think the desire or the dream, well, without the idea of what they might need, i.e. the reality of it, then it is a pure dream. Putting some reality by saying, well, actually, what we need to do to achieve that will be this. Are you still on board? Well, now we've got something different. We've genuinely got a goal, haven't we? So I'm taking us into the goal-setting realm now, which I know is a space that we might want to also explore a little bit, because I'm by no means an expert.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right.
So from that perspective, in terms of how important do you think that is in terms of whether it's the athlete having the goals for themselves and then the coach saying, right, okay, so here's what we're going to now do. Are you on board with these things that we now need to do, all of you, in order to get to this goal? And what experiences have you had, or other athletes have reported to you around how important that kind of process of clarifying what it's going to take to achieve is to the overall journey?
I mean, I would say, at the risk of sounding like a cop-out, it's so individual.
Of course.
I think some athletes, particularly in a sport like, say, athletics, say track and field, where it's one person, one athlete. I mean, yeah, of course, you're in a group, a training group, but you'll still have that relationship is very much one-on-one. I guess it's probably more of a relationship where you would open yourself up and the coach would know, every tiny detail about you and about how you're feeling, how you're thinking.
Yeah.
In a team sport like rowing, where you're perhaps in a squad of 20 women and there's 3 coaches, you probably won't have that individual one-on-one element.
Yeah.
And actually, I just think generally some people are more self-referencing. Look, I need some direction here and here, but I'm happy to kind of make my own way.
Yeah.
And also, I guess it depends in what situation you're in. I mean, on the British rowing team, it's the most successful rowing team in the world, the most successful British Olympic team. Actually, the goal's pretty clear. You're there to win multiple Olympic gold medals, not one, but many.
Yeah.
And if you don't, then you haven't achieved what the team is capable of. So you probably don't need to spell that out as much because it's so clear. And the smaller goals along the way, I think there's something that personally, I always really like to have a really clear plan written down beginning of the season. I want to hit these scores on the rowing machines. I want to do these results in trials. I want to consistently perform at this speed on the water. Whereas, perhaps someone a bit more experienced, like Catherine, she was probably a bit more relaxed about the whole thing because she was there to win a gold medal at the end of each 4 years. Whereas for myself as a younger athlete, actually, I was more focused on the here and now because it was the beginning of my journey. I didn't necessarily know how good I was.
I think for me, I think that's so important though. And I think you having a sense of, this is a personal view, and I think you're right, it is individual, but I think a personal view for me is it's really important that you as the athlete have a genuine sense of a sense of direction, a sense of ownership of what it is, because you ultimately have to make an awful lot of decisions in your life. You have to make, the simplest decisions around, am I going to go out tonight with my friends, or am I going to eat this, or whatever, or how much am I going to drink, or whatever it is. And the further through the closer you get to the elite world, those decisions become even more acute. So I think linking that to what your overall aspiration is, and then working out all the little small, what seem to be incidental things, but quite important decisions ultimately, are quite key, and the coach can't be there for all of those, can they?
No, you're right. And I think, I guess this is a message I always try and put across to young people, is that, people talk about sport, they talk about the big dreams, having those massive ambitions. And it's like, well, yeah, they're there, but if you think about them every day, you're not going to approach them. Because actually you can have your big dreams, but you've got to think small. You've got to think day to day, right, what can I do today that's going to make a 0.0001% difference to my performance tomorrow? What can I do tomorrow? What tiny changes can I make? Because as we all know in sport, you don't make the huge leaps. At the elite level, it doesn't exist. Yeah, at the A level, you might knock 4 seconds off your, in my sport, off your 2,000 meter score on the ergo. Yeah, you might do that. At the elite level, you're not going to. If you improve it at all, it's going to be by 1/10 of a second, and that'll feel just as exciting as the 4 seconds. So actually, you can't walk around thinking of your massive goals. You've got to think about the day-to-day, the tiny goals, like you've just said, the lifestyle changes. Because those are the things at the top level where the margins are so tiny, those are the things that will make a difference.
And I think as the talent equation is obviously about the developing athlete. And we go right down to the very start of the journey, right into the grassroots, all the way through the journey up to, as far as people want to get to. And it's about unlocking potential. So for me, I actually don't think people don't quite fully appreciate. And the other reason the podcast exists as well is because I believe that the talent coach, i.e. the coach working with the adolescents or the kind of the primary school kids, and I don't consider kids at primary school to be, so-called, in inverted commas, talented athletes. It's a little bit early, even though I know there are a lot of people out there would happily talent ID 4-year-olds. That's a different podcast. I believe, you need to get to later and later stages before we start to do the talent identification side of things. However, everybody's on a developmental journey of some kind, whether it's just to get a little bit better so that they can do a bit better in their local football team or their local netball team or whatever it might be, or it's because they want to go on a little bit of development journey to see how good they could be at something. Fine, great, that's all excellent. That's what this exists to do. Now, within all that, one of the things that's really important, I think, is to help young people begin to get to learn how to make some of those decisions. because actually I think they're really important from the perspective of not just sport, but also actually in other aspects of their life. And I think there's lots of aspects of young people's lives nowadays that tend to be a little bit kind of mapped out. There's not a lot of decisions to be made, i.e. we're going to this today, or you've got this timetable at school and you just do this, and this, and then you've got to do this, and this. There's not a lot of decision making there. Whereas I believe, like, for example, with my children, it's like, are you going to go to training tonight? You're going to go to rugby training tonight? And it's like, there's a decision to be made. And there are consequences to those decisions. So you don't want to go to it, that's okay. But, there's a game at the weekend and you may not be able to get in the team for that. But that's up to you. You want to make, because I think that's an important process to go through. Because then if they do decide they want to get a bit better, then and they want to then take the next steps, you're going to have an awful lot of decisions to be made. And so for me, I feel like that's quite an important process. I don't know whether you can resonate with that, or you heard anything through the process of writing the book that you around those themes.
Well, that was something that I really wanted to examine in the book. So my first 2 chapters are all about, well, where do these people come from? Elite athletes. We've established that they're not born on the moon. They're not born in a laboratory. They're regular people. So how come, in a primary school class of 30 kids, why does that one person go on to play rugby for England or compete in Team GB? What is it about that person? And there's a few things that came out, a lot of which I'm sure will be familiar to your listeners in the coaching community. First of all, the idea of the second sibling. Okay. Being the one who's going to be the one who's good at competitive sport. Yeah. So, and of course, this doesn't mean if you are a second sibling, you will succeed. It's just saying it's one of the factors. So the idea is that the theory goes that the first sibling is self-referencing. So they're doing everything for themselves the first time, and they've got no one to compare themselves against. The second sibling or third sibling is always comparing themselves to somebody who's a bit older than them, a bit cleverer, stronger, fitter. So they will lose at everything, but they learn how to do the thing of competing. They learn how to compare themselves in a measurable way. Yeah. And actually, if you look at some of our national sporting heroes, a lot of them are second siblings. And in fact, and I wish I'd recorded the numbers for the book, but of everyone I spoke to for the book, I'd often start by saying, oh, have you got any older brothers or sisters? Virtually everyone said, yeah, I'm the second of 3, or I'm the third of 3, or whatever. Yeah. Including myself, I'm the second of 3 siblings. So it's true of Rebecca Adlington, Victoria Pendleton, Steve Redgrave, Matt Pinson, Harry Kane, Usain Bolt, David Beckham, Chris Hoy, Andy Murray. Just to pick a few of our, like I said, our national sporting treasures. Yeah. Which I think is a really interesting argument. And like I said, it's not that being a second sibling is the thing that makes you succeed, but it's definitely a contributing factor towards that key mental skill, which is the ability to be tested. Yeah. You have to want to be tested. Yeah. And again, I look at myself and my older brother. We both love sport, but he's never been interested in competitive sport. He loves windsurfing, surfing, that kind of stuff. Whereas for me, I've always wanted to be measured and tested and to compete against other people. So it gets that part of your personality out. Yeah. And I think the second thing which came out, and again, I'm sure this won't be news to anyone, is the idea of the rocky road to success. I'm sure lots of your listeners will have read the paper, The Rocky Road to Success, How Talent Needs Trauma. And it's all about how you need to have challenge, you need to have setbacks along the way, because that's the way you develop the coping strategies, the resilience, the mental toughness, that kind of inner core. If you don't have those moments of challenge, you won't develop the coping strategies sufficient to reach the top. And actually the evidence that I looked at held true with that. The evidence suggested that actually the junior world champions, the junior, the age group world record holders, they're not the ones who become the Olympic champions at senior level. Yeah. Actually, it's the people who came 4th or 8th or didn't quite make the team. Yeah. Those are the people who succeed at the senior level. Yeah. Why is that? Because they have a setback, because they lost, because they failed, because they didn't make the team. And actually that teaches you so much about the mental strength, the mental resilience needed. The rocky road is key. And actually, but the problem is it's so counterintuitive, isn't it? If you find a talented young athlete, you want to not cosset them. You want to help them. You want to say, right, I will give you every single advantage. I will give you a team of nutritionists and coaches, and I will give you, free branded kit and all the rest of it. Actually, that's the worst you can do. What you should be saying is, right, if you want this, you get to training on Tuesday night. You have to go and work a Saturday job to afford some football boots. Show us that you want it. And I guess it's a bit like parenting. Your instinct as a parent is to protect your child, isn't it? And keep them away from danger and challenge. But actually, in order for them to not grow up as a snowflake, you need to expose them to challenge and setback and difficulty. So I think the lesson there is when you're designing a talent development program and a pathway for young athletes, actually don't make that road smooth. Make it rocky.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? A lot of debate in this space. It's quite interesting because the author of one of the papers that actually coined the phrase "talent needs trauma," Dave
Collins and McNamara.
Yeah, Anya McNamara and Dave Collins. Yeah, Dave himself has said he kind of wishes he hadn't used that term because I think but no, I mean. It's just an important clarification. I think which is to say that he doesn't really think that talent needs trauma. He's just saying that that traumatic experiences of various levels have a role to play in the development of individuals who happen to go on to achieve sporting success.
Right.
So it's not to say that it needs it. It just seems to be that there is a correlation with it, because I think he was slightly concerned, quite rightly, that people might go away with the message of let's drop kids in the middle of the desert and see how they get on, and you know what I mean. The ones that make it out alive, they're going to go on to great things. So it was a bit like no, it's not that. And also, I think there's a key bit that's also really important to stress, and this came out in the Great British Medalist Project piece of research,
which I quote liberally.
It's a fabulous piece of work, and Lou Hardy's stuff, which is, and I think it's a really important message as well, which is in all those cases, the environment was really key because all of those individuals had something around them that they were able to fall back on to help them with the process of getting through that.
Right. So a strong family, strong coaching setup.
Exactly, because what we don't know, for example, is how many young people going through this journey have a traumatic experience and you never heard of again. So it's what they call survivorship bias. But interestingly, what I think that's really fascinating about this is that point about environment. And I think what I'm excited about that is, so what role does that mean? What role does coach play? What role does parent play? What role does everybody else who's involved in that experience play? And I actually, in the early stages of my career, when I was really, really loving just learning about the whole talent space, I got really interested in epigenetics. I don't know why, I just went down a rabbit hole, really geeked out on it. I'm still quite interested. And I got a book called Design for a Life, How Behaviour Develops by a guy called Professor Patrick Bateson. He's an epidemiologist in Cambridge. And I was reading it, and it was pretty hard. So I thought, I'll go, a bit like you really, I'll go meet him and talk to him and probably make more sense of it that way. And he told me this brilliant story. I'm trying to remember the name of the study, but it basically, I want to say it's the Miller rat study, but it probably isn't Miller, but anyway. And it was basically about nurture nature. Right. And there's this great piece of research that looks at how you can have kind of rats that are either really resilient, can cope in their environment, and rats that are really skittish. Right. And the skittish type of rat tends to come from a skittish mother, yes. But what was associated a skittish mother was a real lack of care, because obviously they're skittish, so they haven't really got the time to be caring for kids, caring for their offspring. Whereas the resilient rats came from resilient mothers who actually did a lot of nurturing. And in the rat world, nurturing comes through licking. Right. So they licked and nurtured their offspring, and that developed resilient rats. What they found was if you take a resilient rat, put it in the cage with the skittish rats, they became skittish.
All right.
So the idea was it's environment, and there's a genetic component to it as well. It actually does.
Environment is key.
Well, environment plays a very important role. And so I think that's a really important thing that I would like to explore more in that space, which is to say, so where we know that the rocky road is important, key, absolutely. And I do think periodized challenge is absolutely key. And I actually think that when we're helping people with, the development of mindset and this, that, and the other, put them in front of challenges is great, but nurturing them through the challenge is also important. They call a challenge point theory. Anybody mention that at all in the kind of exploration?
No, I don't think they did actually.
Yeah, so I guess it's one of those areas that we can all still. It's another area, to discover and explore more about role of environment, role of nurture, role of nature, all those sorts of.
So the question just to kind of sum up what you've just said is the question I really want to answer, which is the title of my first chapter in the book is. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, "You've got a plate of bacon and eggs."
Yeah.
The chicken's involved, but the pig is committed. Right?
Yeah.
So the title of my first chapter is Chickens or Pigs.
Chickens or pigs. Yeah.
You've got some people who come into sport. They're very talented. They've got everything they could need, but you know what? They're just not that bothered about it.
Yeah.
And you've got other people who come in, probably equally as talented, but there's something in their psyche that means I'm going to see this through. I'm going to see how good I can be at hockey. Yeah. I'm going to see how fast I can swim. And they're the pigs. So the question I was trying to answer was, well, what makes a chicken? What makes a pig?
Yeah.
And the answer is we don't know. There's thousands of different factors. We can't separate nature from nurture. We don't really know what the answer is, but there's all these contributing factors along the way. So a lot of athletes will look back and point at and say, well, actually, yeah, it was this. It was not getting selected for the under-16 school team, or it was, my family being very supportive or not being supportive at all. Yeah. There's thousands of different factors in the same way there's thousands of routes to the top. And ultimately, we don't know. But there are pigs and there are chickens. And I'm a pig. I'm not really sure if that's something how I want to describe myself, but there we are.
No, I love that metaphor. It jumped out at me. I interestingly, Professor Bateson, one of the things he said to me was, he said, I think a lot of people traditionally thought of it as being, right, you've got your nature, i.e. you're born with your genetic makeup, and then the environment builds on it. And he says it's actually a more sophisticated and complex picture than that. And he describes it as being, there is a dynamic interplay between the environment and so the nurture and the nature, in the sense that actually the environment plays a role in gene expression. And therefore, this idea of your genes are not your fate. Now, what we don't know, because it's still an emerging field, is which genes can do that, which genes can't, how much you can influence them through environment and this, that, and the other. But I think it's an interesting thing to say, to show that actually what role we might be able to play in the process of supporting an athlete through a developmental journey, and goes right back to what you said at the start, which is, be really careful about the influence you have, both positively and negatively. You can be working at some really quite important levels there.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, environments consist of lots of different people, from the messages a parent gives their kid from a really young age through to that person's first coach, to their friendship group. If you end up hanging around at school with other kids who aren't very sporty, chances are your passion for sport probably won't be manifested. I mean, a lot of people did point at critical turning points to me. They said I was quite interested in my sport, but it was that moment that was the moment that the flame was lit.
Right.
And I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, those turning points.
Yeah. Those sliding doors moments.
Yeah. On the chickens or pigs thing, as people probably already realise.
Not for the vegan listeners amongst us.
No, there's probably, I'm trying to think what the other version would be. On the as people have probably realised already, is I haven't been able to get through the full depth of the book, but there's definitely been bits that have jumped out at me as I've been kind of getting through bits of it, and this conversation's made me realise I really need to get back to it. But one of the things on the chickens or pigs that jumped out to me is there was a passage that you did where you sort of comparing it to an eating drive.
Yeah.
and some people appear to have. And the bit at the end was this idea of that the drive to be number one is a spectrum. Can you unpack that a bit for me?
Yeah, so that wasn't me. I mean, I'd love to say that I said that, but that was Dr. Steve Peters, who I'm sure needs very little introduction.
Chimp paradox.
Psychologist to the stars, psychiatrist to the stars. You know, just had this fascinating career and life, from working in prisons to working with elite athletes. I'm not sure actually if there is much difference there, but anyway. And that's what I said. I mean, I asked the chicken or pig question to him, and he said, you know what, there's so many factors. There's self-esteem in childhood, there's parents, but ultimately some people are just born to be personalities that have a very strong competitive drive. And he likened it to, you know, some people have a real desire to be liked. Some people have a real desire to eat too much. For other people, they're not that bothered about food at all. So there's always a spectrum to be the best. But you know, it's rooted in 100 different places. Maybe it's rooted a bit in being the second sibling. Maybe it's rooted a bit in you know, the genetic inheritance from your parents. We just don't know.
Do you think, though, that idea, though, that but do you think there is almost like this prevailing cultural narrative that being number one requires you to be a certain type of individual, you know, and you know, because you hear these kinds of stories, don't you, in the media, in the popular media, that it's hugely driven and hugely motivated, but actually, and actually, this is something that does come out in the book, and I've seen it in some of the quotes as well, which is, some athletes aren't actually that motivated about being the best. It's actually, some of them, in some cases, they actually hate it. Not hate it, but they don't particularly like it.
Precisely, and I don't think that does always come through. And one of the things I really wanted to do with the book was just bust some of those myths. You know, the portrayal you get in the media is often just so different to the reality. And I think, well, it's like anything, isn't it? Unless you've done it yourself, it's really hard to understand what's going on. But just such a variety of approaches, and you do get everything. You get the strutting peacocks, I'm Olympic champion, and then actually you get the really soft-spoken people saying, yeah, you know, I loved fencing. Fencing was my passion, and luckily enough, I went to the Olympics and I won a medal. But you know, for them, it all stems from just a love for their sport and a passion for what they're doing. It's not about, you know, being the big I am, or getting an MBE or anything like that. It's all about just loving the daily steps of unpicking their sport and understanding it, which is why sport is so fascinating, because there really are 100 different ways to skin a cat. And I think and again, in a team sport, that's even more interesting, because you look around your team and you've got so many different people with different motivations and different things they're good at. And until you get there in that environment, you can't see that from the outside. And
I mean, I'm kind of interested in, like, I mean, so I'm trying to think. There was somebody I met when I was working in golf, Katrina Douglas. She was a professional, played on the Ladies European Tour, and she said that she wasn't all that bothered about golf. She just wanted to. She just wanted to be closer to her dad.
Oh right, he was a golfer.
Well, it was just a way for them to be close. He played golf, and it was a way for them to be close, and they'd have moments together. And then, as a result of that, she got better. And then she just wanted to make him proud. And then she found it actually really quite difficult when she achieved her goal of playing on tour, winning on tour, of actually then maintaining the motivation, because she'd sort of achieved her goal, which is to make firstly to be close to her dad and make her dad proud. But a lot of athletes don't talk openly about those kinds of motivations, but they're really important.
No, absolutely. And again, this is something that I really wanted to unpick in the book, because I have an idea of what was motivating me and what I wanted to achieve, but for every single person, that's a different question. And some people are motivated by just the day-to-day killing themselves at training. You know, we all know exercise gives you endorphins, gives you that buzz, and actually when you retire, it is a bit like going cold turkey, because you don't get that buzz every day. Suddenly life on the outside seems a lot less interesting than it does on the inside, because you're lacking those that daily lift. I mean, I include a quote in the book from a guy called Andrew Selby, who was a Team GB boxer and then turned professional. And I didn't interview him. This was a quote he gave to, I think it was the BBC. And he said, "I don't like boxing. I just like the money. Who would like boxing? Who likes getting punched in the face? I'm just here to pick up a check." And I admire his honesty apart from anything. Yeah, I mean, I remember, in fact, in the 2012 Olympics, when we just arrived in the village and all kind of checked in. So this is before we started competing, but the games had started. And we had a little welcome chat from Clive Woodward, the former England rugby coach, who I'm not sure if he still is, but at that point he was working for the British Olympic Association in some capacity. I forget what.
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
And he sat us down and he said, welcome to the games. I'm sure you're going to put in performances you're proud of. Just gave us a bit of a G up. And then he said, I remember this sticking in my mind. He said something that the 2003 England team really talked about was, how do you want to be remembered? Is that important to you? How do you want to be remembered? And think about that when you're at the games. How do you want to be remembered? I remember sitting there thinking, that means nothing to me. I don't care how I'm remembered. As long as I do my best and I make my family proud and the rest of my team proud and we race as fast as we can, I don't care if people remember me or not. Maybe I'm remembered for doing, I don't know, some kind of naked skinny dipping after my medal ceremony if I win. If that's how I'm remembered, quite frankly, I don't care. I'm just here for my rowing.
Yeah.
But maybe there was other people in the room that really resonated with, and they said, yeah, actually, I want to create a legacy. I want people to know my name.
Yeah.
I mean, the motivation piece is so fascinating because, why do you do what you do, Stuart? Why have I just written this book?
Yeah, exactly.
We've all, it's a series of accidents. We've all got different things that are driving us and different things that fascinate us. I mean, there's some people out there who probably have never put on a pair of trainers in their life and think sport is completely mad. I mean, they'd probably be right in some respects, but, and in fact, that was for me, just going back to the motivation question, that was a real key turning point when I started writing the book. So I wrote a sample chapter, first of all, for Bloomsbury before writing the book itself. And one of the things I wanted to explore in the sample chapter was motivation. Why do people do what they do? And so I thought, I'm not really sure what I think about this. So I just typed out a quick text message on my phone, sent it to about 10 friends, all elite athletes, all from different sports. And it just said something like, when you were competing, were you doing it because you loved your sport or were you doing it because you wanted to be successful? Pretty simple question. And I had 10 completely different responses back.
Wow.
And in fact, the 10th one just said, I've got too much to say on this. You have to call me. I won't say who that was from because she is fairly chatty. And I think that was the moment that I really thought, okay, I can write a book about this. There's a lot to say here. Because I don't know, I guess I thought that most people would probably just say, yeah, I love my sport and being successful was a way I measured how good I was. But no. People were coming from a variety of different places.
And also, there's that added complexity for those of us who are trying to tap into people's motivation, as coaches, for example, and trying to pull it out. Is you've got a couple of things. One is, there's a few things to talk about. One is motivations can change.
Absolutely.
So particularly with adolescents as they grow, motivations can change week to week. Never mind day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. That's one thing. Second thing is, sometimes what people say their motivation isn't. So actually getting underneath that is really important. I had an experience not long ago when I was working with, somebody pretty close to me who was going through some real difficulty, proper life difficulties, And I wasn't particularly, I wouldn't ever claim to be, a kind of an expert in this, but I just found myself in a situation where I had to kind of tap into some of the things I'd learned through being a coach to maybe provide them with, some clarity, some help. And actually what we discovered was that there was actually quite a bit of dishonesty, like self-delusion almost, this saying things about what they wanted that they really didn't want, but they felt like they had to say that because that's what's expected. And I think that's also really important to get underneath that, genuinely, right? What are we really here for, And that's why I think your book's really powerful, because in many ways, I think it gives people permission to be honest about why they're here. You don't have to say the thing that the people expect to hear. You can say the thing that's really on your mind. It's all right,
Yeah. If you're doing it, particularly some of the men on the rowing team, if you're doing it because you get really big muscles if you row, and that looks good in a shirt, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. If that's the thing that makes you the best athlete you could be, there's no issue there, But just I think people need to understand the thing that really resonates with them and really drives them. And I guess, my own career, I joined the British rowing team and suddenly it's this environment where it's, Steve Redgrave and just, Olympic gold medals coming out of everyone's ears. And at first I thought, well, winning Olympic gold medal, that's not my goal. I'm a 21-year-old, wet behind the ears. I don't know what I'm doing. I just want to figure out what is rowing, what is this sport? Who are these other people on the team? Where do I fit into it? And it wasn't until a few years later, in fact, not until I won the World Championships the first time, that I thought, okay, fine, Olympic gold, that is now my goal. Was it my goal before that? No, not at all. Didn't mean anything to me. I'd never been to the Olympics. I didn't necessarily, that seemed a really long way away. I came fourth at the World Championships, and that really spurred me to think, do you know what, I can do better than this. I'm going to win this next year. And then luckily, I'm not saying that this is probably more coincidence than anything, but I did win it the next year. And it wasn't until I won it that I thought, fine, okay, I'm now going to set my sights on the gold at the Games, and that's what I'm here for. But was that my goal since I was a kid? No, of course it wasn't. If you're just a regular kid growing up in the middle of Cornwall, why would you imagine you're going to go to the Olympics one day? Yeah. To me, goals and motivation, it's really personal.
Yeah. Listen, I could talk to you all day, but I know you're under a bit of time pressure to go and do what you need to do. So before I let you go, how do people get in touch? I'm certain that people will want to maybe hear from you more, or maybe get you to come and talk to them. I know you do a lot of that. So what's the best way for them to reach out?
Sure. I mean, I have a website. On my website, there's my contact email address. If not, I'm on Twitter at Annie Vernon GB. And the book is available all major booksellers, including Amazon. And please leave me an Amazon review if you like it.
Brilliant stuff. Annie, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I've really enjoyed talking to you. All the best with everything else that's going on.
Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed it too.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.